Assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to yet another Tabadla Policy Roundtable. One of the hottest topics under discussion globally, locally, really almost everywhere is vaccination. And of course, with the terrible situation in India, the realization that a lot of the pain of the COVID-19 pandemic is still not over. Vaccinations seem like the surest bet towards achieving some kind of resistance to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the aspects that's really fascinating is the stark inequality and division between the global haves and the global have-nots in terms of countries. The emerging conversation, particularly in places like the United States, is the idea that vaccine diplomacy by countries like China, Russia, and until recently India, although that conversation obviously has changed, but that vaccine diplomacy is about anything other than saving lives. And of course, diplomacy of any sort is really about pursuing a national interest. What we wanted to do today is convene a small group of experts that can talk to us more about both how this conversation is seen in places like China and Russia, but also how the conversation plays out in the countries where the indigenous capacity for vaccine production, for patent production is relatively limited. I'm joined by, and I'm privileged to be joined by a fantastic panel today. We are joined by Elizabeth Mirab from the Nation Media Group. I believe she's joining us from Nairobi. We have Saad Umar from the Yale Institute of Health. I believe he's in New Haven, Connecticut, which is a long way from Kenya. But closer to home in Kenya, we have joining us Paul. Paul is at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. And Paul Nantulia, thank you for joining us as well. And we expect to be joined by Victor Gao from the China Center for Growth and Globalization. So I want to start off by just saying thank you to the three of you, and thank you in advance to Victor if he's able to join us. And maybe start off with you, Elizabeth. Give us a sense of what the conversation around vaccine diplomacy is currently in Africa. There is definitely a sense that China is trying to take advantage of the situation. This is something that we hear regularly from within the Western press. I wonder if the same sentiment is prevalent in Africa and the areas and issues that you cover.
Thank you, Musharraf. What I'd say currently we are observing as a continent is a shortage of vaccines across the 54 countries. And one of the things that we have definitely seen with Africa when it comes to the COVID vaccination is the predominance of the AstraZeneca vaccine. So when you talk about China's relation to African countries, of course, most of us have seen the infrastructure that has been built by China. But now, with this pandemic, we are having a different kind of engagement. And as of today, I think from the press briefing, we just had that the WHO is currently deliberating if they will issue emergency use listing for both Chinese-made vaccines, that's the Sinopharm and the Sinovac. That if the emergency use listing is approved, of course, is issued, then it will change a lot of things, because one of the things that have been predominant is the shortage of the vaccines. So definitely with the emergency use listing, I think it's one of the things that many countries are just waiting for to introduce the vaccines, because they're readily available and they're in large production. So when you look at the West, the US, was it yesterday or in the course of the week, decided to release the 60 million doses of AstraZeneca. But they're coming in at a time when these decisions are being made. Morocco already introduced one of the vaccines from China earlier on, before any country in the continent had started vaccination. So it is going to be a very interesting dynamic in the coming weeks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Saad, I wanted to bring this over to you. Sitting in North America and following this conversation, it, of course, is materially relevant to everything that you do. Maybe say a little bit about the science that should be accompanying this conversation. It seems that so much of the conversation on vaccine diplomacy is initiative and President Xi and Vladimir Putin. Really stuff that has nothing to do with the fundamentals of how we're going to fight and beat COVID-19. As a scientist and sitting where you are, how do you see this conversation and where would you like to see it go?
That's a really good way of starting the focus on this. And I felt that the conventional framing of a vaccine diplomacy has been a little bit narrow. From my perspective, this is not a zero-sum game. And so one way of looking at it is that this is a pandemic that is impacting pretty much everyone, and high and low income countries. And we're not going to have a sustainable control of this outbreak unless it is controlled pretty much everywhere. That's fairly apparent. For example, if this outbreak is rampant in a country as large as India, the likelihood of new variants coming up, which are eventually resistant to vaccines that you have everywhere, is a possibility. Right now, the data are fairly good, but you can't predict that is not going to happen. So that's a real concern. So starting from that, one approach could be that not to treat this as a zero-sum game, that there's a finite types of vaccines and there's a finite supply of vaccines, and to treat it in a way that we need to get 50 to 70% of the world's population vaccinated in the next 2 to 3 years, and then work backwards from there. Is there technology that is on the table that is useful for that purpose? How do you make it available to all sorts of countries where you don't rely on 1 or 2 countries' supply, but there is flexibility in the system, and you can ramp up doses to such an extent that you decrease the risk for everyone? That discussion has been missing in this zero-sum game approach. And so the way to deal with this is to look at some of the IP issues, look at the current scientific evidence of efficacy and safety of a few products, look at manufacturing issues that need to be addressed, look at distribution issues, and then come up with a set of global end-to-end solutions that benefit everyone. So this narrow framing, I'm afraid, is going to get all of us into trouble.
Thanks, Saad. I think that's a scientifically valid way of looking at it, and I think a lot of us wish that it was like that. Paul, maybe explain to us, from your perspective, the dynamics within Africa, and maybe talk a little bit more about some of the bigger countries in Africa, because I suspect countries like Nigeria and South Africa would have a slightly different conversational trajectory than maybe smaller nations in Africa. What prevents, or what is likely to prevent the conversation from going in the direction Saad is talking about and continuing in the direction that it's already in, which is this kind of zero-sum game where you're either with China or Russia or you're with the West?
No, thank you very much, Musharraf. It's a pleasure to be on the show. And I would just like to thank my other panelists on the show. Look, I don't think you can get away from this. What my other panelists have called a zero-sum game. I don't think you can get away from it. simply because the virus originated in China. It originated in China. And during those early months, there was a lot of contention between China and Chinese thinkers and strategists and academics, and United States and their counterparts in the United States. So it fed into the COVID-19, the eruption of the COVID-19 pandemic, fed into existing geopolitical narratives of competition between China as an emerging power and the United States as an established power. So unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has flowed. The issues within COVID have flowed and reinforced those narratives. So if you look at what is happening on the African continent, bearing in mind that this is a very critical year for China, because the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, which is the major China-Africa summit that happens every 3 years, is going to take place. It's going to take place in Senegal. And South Africa is going to be handing over to Senegal as the current co-chair, or FOCAC, co-chairing FOCAC together with China. So if you look at the debates that have been happening in the South African press, there's been a lot of analysis and a lot of discussion about what all these narratives mean. Essentially, the debates have been framed, and if you look at Nigeria as well, you find a very, very similar, very interestingly, very similar discussion about the idea that it erupted in China, the pandemic erupted in China, but the manner in which China has been able to control it and to contain it has been seen as more competent. The Chinese government has portrayed itself as having been more competent than the United States and the West. We saw what happened in Italy. We saw what happened in the United Kingdom. We saw what happened in the United States. I mean, the virus just completely went out of control, in terms of the numbers of people infected, the infections per day, which are still very high even as we speak right now, as well as the number of deaths, the number of fatalities. And there has been pushback as well from the United States, from different think tanks that have been, responding to how the Chinese government and Chinese state-owned media, the narratives that they have been pushing on the African continent. China has a very large media presence in Africa, has a very large media presence in the developing world. So whatever discussions have taken place on the African continent have really not been necessarily targeted at African countries, but African countries have really provided a segue or an avenue for China to be able to espouse its global ideas and norms. And certainly these have been very much tinged with what we're calling the geopolitical narratives that have come out of Beijing. And which have been reacted to by the United States and other Western countries. So I think African countries have been caught up in this, and the debates are really raging. Actually, right here where I'm sitting right now as well, this is something that keeps coming up in the press every other day.
Paul, just if you could expand a little bit further on how this, how the actual debate then influences decision making. Is it likely that countries that opt for the China vaccine, and there's not just one Chinese vaccine, but I think Sinopharm seems to be the one that whose production is currently at a scale that can afford China the ability to export it. Certainly, that's the case in Pakistan. But maybe talk a little bit about whether the provision of the vaccine is seen as a quid pro quo on sort of Main Street, for example, in Kampala or in Dar es Salaam or other sort of mid-sized African countries where China may or may not have been already investing via the BRI.
Well, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag because, for instance, if you look at what happened in Nigeria when the Chinese medical teams went in and China made that big push to provide personal protective equipment, medical advice, and things of that sort, there was an instant reaction by the Nigerian Medical Association. This is the big, very influential group in Nigeria that even advises the Ministry of Health and the Nigerian government. And they said, look, Nigeria has its own indigenous capacity to fight COVID-19. And it said in a statement that given that this pandemic originated in China, China doesn't really have the moral authority to be able to provide this type of help to Nigeria. So that is one end of the spectrum. But on the other end of the spectrum, there is one finds a general acceptance within the popular press. Certainly, you've seen it in East Africa, you've seen it in Southern Africa, that China is better placed. China is better placed to help African countries solve this pandemic, and that's for three reasons. The first is that during the pandemic, when everybody was scrambling to kind of understand what was going on, China made some serious inroads on the African continent. It brought together the ministries of health in over, I believe the figure is 54 countries, brought them together to discuss the pandemic and to basically to put on the table their needs, what they needed, the kind of help they needed from China. Immediately after that, this meeting happened in March of last year. And in April, China started then having bilateral discussions with different ministries of health, bearing in mind that you already have, as we speak, 45 Chinese medical teams deployed in different African countries, assisting with the COVID-19 response. So there is that general acceptance. And I think a lot of it has to do with the political ties that China has built on the African continent, and the perception that as a so-called fellow developing country, China has a better understanding of the health needs of African countries. Remember that China has programs where Chinese hospitals and African hospitals from different provinces and different districts have these what they call pairing agreements, twinning agreements. Just a few less than a mile from where I'm speaking, you have a larger friendship, these friendship hospitals that China has been building in these different African countries. That has also been part of the conversation. And when you look at what is happening in the press, there is a general acceptance. Now, obviously, there's obviously a difference between perception and reality, but there is a perception that China perhaps is better placed simply because of the types of ties that China has on the African continent, and how China has been perceived for a very, very long time as having been a champion, for instance, for African independence and African aspirations, such as the construction of infrastructure. These elements cannot be delinked from the discussion of COVID-19 and from the COVID-19 narratives that China has been spreading around the African continent.
Thanks, Paul. Elizabeth, if you're still with us, there you are. One thing that I'm conscious of in this conversation, and I think that I'll be very candid. I think this is a learning process for someone like myself as well. But I am conscious that we're talking about 54 different countries, with governments and multiple headed political oppositions, right? Different systems of governance, different ethnicities, religions, languages. And oftentimes, it's easy to say, look, Africa is not a country. There's this meme that Africa is not a country. But even in this conversation, I feel like maybe we're falling into that trap. Is that a fair observation? And what is it that we can do about this? Because it seems to me that if any country is capable of talking to African nations on their own terms in the bilateral way that Paul just described, it would be China, because it has substantial bilateral programs with many, if not all, 54 African Union nations. Is the Western inability to parse and differentiate between what constitutes the mass that is Africa part of the reason why the West might be falling behind in terms of the narrative in Africa?
Well, I think it could be because you see, for China, when the infrastructure and the bilateral agreements all started, there was sort of a deliberate effort to engage individual countries. Like, for instance, here in Kenya, there's so many Chinese run infrastructural programs. We are currently building an expressway connecting the international airport to trying to connect the international to create an express connectivity between the international airport to the central business district. And you see that as a huge development that is being done by China. Now, when it comes to the pandemic specifically, I don't think African countries, as much as there have been bilateral agreements, there has been a deliberate effort by the Africa CDC to look at these 54 countries as a bloc, to negotiate as a bloc. And when you look at the African, when you look at the African Continental Free Trade that is being pushed for local to unite these countries, Africa is negotiating as a regional, as a continent. It's not negotiating as 54 different countries. And for this pandemic, it has been very crucial, because when we are negotiating, or when you're negotiating to have local manufacturing for vaccines, for instance, something that um, uh, there was a meeting 2 weeks ago on this issue. 54 countries or member states came together to negotiate on how Africa can move from entirely depending on the West, or entirely depending on donors, to sustain its social and financial capabilities, to developing its own infrastructure. Because one thing that we have seen is this whole pandemic has moved from vaccine nationalism to vaccine diplomacy, where now countries are realizing that there is a continent for which opportunities arrive in negotiating or using the vaccines as a tool for negotiations. And for China, I think by individually interacting with countries, it has been able to reinforce this mentality that Africa is not a country, but a continent with 54 individual countries that can negotiate on their own terms. Unlike the perception that you can negotiate with this regional bloc and take it as one wholesome bloc without looking at the different issues and economic stabilities, economic powers and political stabilities in different parts of the continent.
But that really aligns with what my perception or my concern was on this front. But there's certainly also is it also possible that the treatment of the continent as a bloc, as a unitary entity, also comes with some advantages. For example, if there's a relaxation of a patent for all of Africa, it then I mean, that certainly, at least in my mind, would seem to be much more advantageous than trying to negotiate a patent, undoing or delicensing or decertification. Some method by which African manufacturers could engage in manufacturing things that are patent protected in other parts of the world. Are there any benefits? How is it seen in Africa? Is it seen as a sum that it's not that African nations need to be dealt with on a one-on-one basis. What's the other side of the debate? Is there another side of the debate? Are there advantages to working as a bloc?
Definitely, there are advantages, and I'll go back to the pandemic because that has been my area of focus. When you look at the vaccine introduction or vaccine purchase, the continent is using the Africa CDC, is going through the Africa CDC and the Afri, I keep Afri, Afrexim Bank, yeah, to negotiate as a block, which is advantageous because then you get better prices, you get lower prices for the doses that you're buying, compared to if you're having a bilateral agreement where you're negotiating with the manufacturer based on their terms. For instance, Kenya right now is thinking of uh, going for bilateral agreements to get other vaccines to boost its vaccination because currently the 1 million doses that we received are fast running out. But you find that through the Africa CDC, they have been able to sign an agreement and a contract with Johnson and Johnson to provide these 54 countries with a platform to buy almost 400 million doses through the bank and through the AVAT, the African Vaccination Acquisition Task Force. Yeah, that is an advantage because the prices definitely will not be the same as if as when you're negotiating as an individual country. But I think the uptick, and I think this is one of the things that is affecting the African continental free trade, is the uptick and the acceptance that this continent can work as a unit is still something that many countries are struggling to be on board with, because you find that on one hand, South Africa is able to has the economic capability to buy the vaccines on their own without going through the Africa CDC and make its own decisions. And on the other hand, you have a country that cannot buy these vaccines and provide them to its population. Sorry. Yet at the end of the day, we are looking at a situation where I'm not safe until we are all safe. So definitely for me, I think it has its advantages, especially when it comes to medicine. Um, the ability to build the infrastructure and the health system in the continent as a region, as a bloc, is better because then you're able to conduct a continental. You can travel to one country for medical tourism, and like depending on say the West or Asia, for instance, for medical tourism. So those are for me, those are the advantages of working as a bloc.
I think it's a fascinating topic, and just the fact that you mentioned these different bodies, including this, I think it was the AVAC, the Africa Vaccination Task Force, is an example of 54 countries coming together. Here in Pakistan, we have 4 provinces and the federal government, and we've struggled on many key issues, including vaccine procurement. And we've only had about 2 million vaccination shots administered so far, and we're already looking at the beginning of May. So I'm familiar with how difficult it is to work together, and amazed that these 54 countries have managed to work together. Saad, what I guess the big question I have, is again going back to the science on this. What do these conversations do to the science? In terms of incentives, right? If Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer or Moderna are at some point in time, and it looks I mean, certainly that conversation is out there that some of these firms might be forced to give up their patent or at least give up the rates at which they might expect to be returned on their research. What does that do to the quantum of research and to the Western capitalist model, which is really a quasi-capitalist? I would call it more of a Matsukato capitalism, right? That's how all medicine comes about, because without the protection and the investments from the public sector, a lot of this stuff doesn't happen. But being that as it may, what we're seeing from Russia and from China is something fundamentally different, right? These are almost entirely state-driven interventions. If we accept the purely Western version of this, which I don't necessarily accept, but there is some merit to it, that these countries, China and Russia, are investing in these conversations for larger strategic purposes. Even if we accept that, what is the impact of the conversation around patents and the negotiations with, for example, the Africa Union? How does that impact the science and the scientists working at these firms and the ones that engage with people like yourself at Yale University?
So that's a very nuanced question. And what has happened is that, and a lot of people don't realize that in the West and throughout the world, that a lot of the actual scientific development in terms of vaccines and other drugs as well, but specifically for vaccines, has been funded by, the cutting edge stuff has really been funded by the taxpayers for the last 15, 20 years. And I say, after looking at a lot of these things systematically, that where did the idea originate? Who paid for it, and then who scaled it up? So the usual model is that the highest risk research that happens is taxpayer funded. The ideas, etc. When years after after years of struggling with the technology or concept, including, for example, the so-called mRNA technology, it was a no-go for a long time for scaled-up production, because there were scientific challenges to making sure that a messenger RNA is stable, it can be delivered effectively, etc., and can achieve desired effects. And all of that, or most of that, happened through public sector investments in this technology. Then the next step comes, becomes development, and then sharing of this IP with manufacturers. And so at that stage, there's some risk taken by the companies themselves. So they're not themselves engines of basic research in the modern vaccine manufacturing ecosystem, even in the West. But they are really good at looking at products that are promising, then making bets on them, fine-tuning them. Their innovation comes in manufacturing. So coming up with a concept of an mRNA vaccine and producing lots of these vaccines, different vaccine lots, etc., that are used for research is one thing, but to scale it up to a giant scale, which is required to vaccinate countries, populations, continents in certain cases, and the world, that requires specialized know-how that these companies produce. And then comes the clinical trial infrastructure that used to be traditionally driven by these companies' own investments, but for this pandemic saw huge public sector investments. So what implications these discussions have? Well, first of all, companies would want to and do want to safeguard their own interests in terms of, the more IP control they have, the better it is, with certain limits, etc. For example, there are examples that AstraZeneca earlier on said that they're not going to make money over the vaccine supplied to low and middle income countries, and were more proactive in licensing their technology to Serum Institute of India. But that's not universal. But on the other hand, in terms of the science itself, I don't think there's a direct impact if this IP is shared a little bit more broadly, is because in the basic innovation, the high-end innovation is not coming from company investments. And I'll give you an example. The HIV drugs. So we have had a reasonable pipeline of these drugs, and from the outset, these were drugs developed mainly, especially the first-in-class drugs, were developed through public sector investments, through investments in research and technology from the government. but that hasn't slowed down. The fact that the access is better hasn't slowed down the engines of innovations. That doesn't mean that it won't have impact of, the free sharing of intellectual property is not going to have an impact on the bottom lines of a few companies and their desire, their know-how. The big bottleneck is that the know-how to scale up production. And so therefore, I believe in the long run, the end-to-end solution perspective that you start with the IP that has already been paid pretty substantially by Western taxpayers, and then bringing on board the manufacturers and providing incentives for scaling up of manufacturing to such an extent that it can cover countries beyond the developed world. I think is the way to go. One more thing I would add is that there is increasing recognition, and there's a small but growing and vociferous sector of Western taxpayers who recognize that it's actually they paid for this technology, and they don't like the photos coming out of funeral pyres and large-scale mass burials and so on and so forth. So there is some internal push, and as you saw, that the relaxation of some of the restrictions and a relatively more proactive posture towards sharing both technology and supplies with India recently by the US a lot of it was driven by internal taxpayer noise that was created and the perception that was created that the US should be doing something.
I think that's really vital, that last point that you made. But throughout what you just said, Saad, I was thinking about whether or not this represents maybe a game-changing opportunity for countries like Pakistan, but also for any of the 54 African nations. Paul, maybe talk a little bit about whether you see any kind of change in approach or change in thinking within Africa. Is it possible that the vaccination conversation and the fact that vaccinations, or at least something close to universal vaccinations in Africa, might take another year and a half, 2 years? If that is the case, will that spur a conversation about localization, and will it spur a conversation about whether or not African pharmaceutical firms want to continue to be basically printing presses for pre-existing science, or whether there might be a bigger focus on research and development? I think Serum Institute of India might be the most famous and largest of the developing world sort of settings where it's not just a reproduction facility, but also an R&D facility. Could COVID-19 and the vaccination conversation lead to something transformational for the pharmaceutical sector, at least in Africa?
Thanks, Musharraf, and thanks, Saad, for that very excellent intervention. Look, I hope so. I hope so. One of the things that the larger China-Africa community of scholars and thinkers, we've been talking about African agency. Where is the Africa agency in that relationship, right? So the meetings I mentioned earlier that President Xi Jinping hosted, those were Chinese initiatives. Those are not African initiatives, okay? Xi Jinping also offered, 2 billion, to assist African countries cope with this pandemic. Africa was the single most important region that he focused on. If you listen to the speech that he gave to the WHO, to the World Health Organization Assembly, he was really trying to send a strategic message that China was better positioned to understand African countries. But I've had discussions with African public health specialists who say that there was a poor understanding. There was a poor understanding on the part of some of these interventions, some of these external interventions, about what African countries really needed. So the point was put across. And I recall a conversation I had a point was put across that what African countries are trying to do is adopt a public health principles approach towards this pandemic. So it's not really about sort of like the kind of assistance that China was providing, which is try and strengthen the health capacity, very clinical approach. A lot of African public health specialists were saying, look, we've seen what has happened in the United States, where if you're focusing on that sort of like clinical approach, what happens is that people are going to get into the public health system and then it's going to collapse, no matter how wealthy you are. That's the lesson that African countries learned. So the approach was basically to say, how can we change behavior? How can we pursue a behavior change approach? We therefore need to have grassroots-based communication strategy. We need to have these health interventions at the local level. That's the kind of assistance they needed. They needed that kind of push. Now the question is, did these African ministries of health and public health specialists communicate that to the Chinese? That's an open question. That's a really open question. And it comes back to the issue of agency, that many of these initiatives that we have seen between China and its African counterparts really originate in Beijing. Yes, it's true that you do have quite a number of cases. You look at South Africa, you look at Ghana, you look at Liberia, you look at Sierra Leone, you look at Senegal. Some of these countries have been very, very strategic in the ways in which they've been able to engage the People's Republic of China on different issues, including the kind of assistance they've received in the pandemic response. But unfortunately, these cases of African agency are really, at the moment, they're really individual and they're really happening at the bilateral level. You don't really have like a continental response. One of the things that that we've been pushing, and when I say we, we're talking about the larger China-Africa community, is saying for a change, there ought to be an African, sort of like what Elizabeth was talking about a few minutes ago, an African strategy, an African response, so that when African countries go to FOCAC, they have something on the table. They have an agenda that has been negotiated over time, that has involved the regional economic communities, that have involved civil society, so that the continent is speaking with one voice. The continent has spoken with one voice before, during the anti-apartheid struggle, for instance, and during all these, malaria, for instance, the manner in which African countries collaborated on issues of malaria, on sleeping sickness, on yellow fever. We don't see that happening now. So I think there's a lot of room. There's a lot of room. I think African agency in China-Africa relations is still evolving, but it's not really where it should be. And I think that is the kind of that gap affects what individual African countries can do to ensure that Chinese assistance is channeled towards what African countries really need and what African publics need, because it's a public health crisis. It's not just about governments and not just about elites. It's also about the public health workers, that you find that have really been on the front line of trying to fight this pandemic. So I think we would like to see, essentially, what Africans would like to see is a greater agency on the part of the African Union and regional economic communities in terms of engaging not just China, but also Russia and United States and other external powers.
So, Musharraf, I think you're on mute, unless you want to mime your way through the rest of the program, which would be perfectly fine with me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Saad. What I had said was I want to take the question of Russia. I'm really glad you brought up Russia, because that's a topic that, we were supposed to delve into a lot more, but it's just been fascinating dealing with the China aspect of this thus far. So I'll come to you in a second, Elizabeth. But before I do, Paul, I wanted to just dig a little bit deeper on the question of agency. When you mentioned malaria, and again, this is a layperson's perspective sitting thousands of miles away. Even on the malaria question, some might argue that the agency there was consumed or was taken captive by George W. Bush's Millennium Challenge Corporation, right? A lot of the fight against like the credit for these fights often doesn't go to maybe where it belongs and where the fight is taking place on the battleground, but often, far away where that agency is consumed for many reasons. Some are geopolitical, some might have to do with domestic politics. Do you see a shift in that, or do you see that the both the COVID-19 pandemic response writ large, but specifically the vaccination aspect of it, because of the fact that these vaccines are being made in third countries, that's a trend that will continue?
I hope it does. I hope it does. I mean, Uganda, for instance, Uganda has invested in developing, as we speak, its own vaccine. They've had a team of scientists that have been in touch with fellow scientists in the United States, in other countries. They were involved in studying the virus, looking at the different variants, mapping them, looking at behaviors and all that. And so there is an initiative in Uganda to develop a vaccine, to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. Now, this hasn't really been publicized, internationally, but there's that that effort. One can only hope that that we begin to see more and more of these sorts of collaborations, and perhaps COVID-19 might wake these African countries up to meeting some of these challenges. I definitely agree with you that the malaria initiative as well. I mean, we could have seen more agency even on HIV and AIDS. The ABC formula for combating HIV and AIDS actually originated on the African continent. It originated on the African continent, but not a whole lot of credit has been given to African countries for that. African countries have really been on the front line of trying to grapple and come to terms with all manner of infectious disease. I mean, by the time the COVID-19 outbreak erupted, many African countries, I mean, in this region, for instance, in East Africa, were dealing with an Ebola outbreak and different types of outbreaks. So there is an institutional memory that African countries have been able to build. The problem is that it's not very systematic. It's not very systematic, and by and large, that donor-recipient relationship continues to define the interactions between African countries and their external partners, China, Russia, and all the others. So I still think that yes, there's some success stories, if I may say so. In Senegal, we've also seen initiatives of that nature. We've seen initiatives of that nature in places like Botswana. But I think at the moment, like I mentioned before, it's still it's few and far between. You still don't really have a coherent African approach. And I think that's probably something that the COVID-19 pandemic should be able to teach these African Union member states.
I'm fascinated by this line of or this direction of the conversation, Paul. I mean, I would love to dig more deeply into, the effects of, certain kinds of leadership models. Uganda's an interesting one with President Museveni, but even, something better known to Western audiences in terms of, Zimbabwe, and, this kind of, whether or not that kind of nationalism maybe enables the conversation going further into the direction of greater African agency, obviously with the caveats that would come with these heavily personalized narratives of African nationalism. But that's definitely for another day. Elizabeth, on Russia, we've talked a lot about China, but not at all about Russia, and I was hoping it would be a little bit different. Is that because Russia is not that much on the scene in Africa, or is it just because we haven't gotten to it?
I think we just haven't gotten to it, because when you go back to this whole narrative of vaccine diplomacy, Russia and China sort of are competing against each other on who will have a foothold on the continent, because um, at the beginning of the year, that was February, Russia had offered around 300 million doses to the African Union vaccine acquisition team, the AU financing, the AU arm that is responsible for signing these agreements and contracts. It is just the same thing that China is doing with the Sinopharm and Sinovac vaccine. But you find that the Sputnik vaccine first, it, if you remember, when the efficacies of these vaccines were being made public, it is among the first vaccines whose efficacies was made public, and was heavily disputed by the US and even China. And right now you find that Sputnik has gained, Russia has, through Sputnik, has gained a lot of access in African countries. Here in Kenya, we were right after we started the national vaccination program, a private company imported around 775,000 doses of Sputnik, and the country later banned it. But you find that it's still being offered despite having been banned. So I think for Russia, it's gearing up for the 2022 summit, the 2022 Russia-Africa summit. And this is one of the ways, I think, to entice Africa to have sort of these negotiations and have this competition with China. But if you remember, there was a quote that the head of Africa CDC, Dr. John Kengasong, said at the beginning when these vaccines were being offered to Africa, that Africa will refuse, and I quote, Africa will refuse to be that playing ground where we use COVID as a tool to manage relationships. And he went on to say that it becomes like you're trying to sprinkle water on a very hot day on children. Then you can tick the box that you did that. So you can see as it's like these two countries are in competition, and each is sort of gearing up for its own summit. And these vaccines now are being used as a tool to uh, open the way for uh, for the negotiations that will take place in the summit. It's one of the things that I'm looking forward to, watching what negotiations will come out from that summit.
Elizabeth, to what extent do you think that, I think you quoted the African Union president, right, in terms of not allowing Africa to become a battleground or, for this competition. But it feels like from the conversation we've had today that indeed there has been this playgroundification or battlegroundification for Africa. Do you feel that if he was asked about whether he felt successful in having achieved that vision or not, how do you think he would respond, or what is your view on whether that has worked out?
So just to correct you, I was quoting the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention
I apologize. Yeah.
Director, Dr. John Kangasong. If I may go back to today's briefing, because it's the latest, and he was talking about the current agreements there are with the vaccine manufacturers. And so far, he stated with a lot of conviction that the only agreement and contract that has been signed that has any legal binding is with the Johnson and Johnson. Every other manufacturer, be it Sputnik, be it Sinopharm, be it Sinovac, Moderna, Pfizer, none of those manufacturers have any solid agreement with the Africa CDC. And this is the body that is pushing for a continental purchase or procurement of vaccines so that there's better negotiation, negotiating power, sorry. Now, you've asked me if the feeling is still the same, if this continent will refuse to be the playing ground. From how he talks, it is the same. The feeling is still the same as when the issues of vaccines came up. From my personal feeling, we have seen. I'll go back to what I said. We have seen this conversation shift from vaccine nationalism, where the US, the UK have vaccinated their populations to an extent where now they are lifting some of the public health measures they've put in place, like wearing of masks. I just saw that the CDC has directed uh, Americans that they can now, has advised Americans that they can now go interact without wearing masks unless they're in the presence of strangers. Having done that, now they are moving to catch up in this vaccine diplomacy. And this is the point where, as an African and as an African journalist, people and policymakers are trying to make a change that we are not going to sit and wait for a repeat of what happened during the HIV epidemic to repeat itself now. And that is why the local manufacturing negotiations and conversations are being brought up and being ramped up. In fact, again, in today's briefing, as I wind up, the director of the Africa CDC mentioned that in the coming 6 months, we should be seeing movements with regards to Africa's transition to locally manufacturing its own vaccines. Though at this point we will have a finish and fill kind of arrangement as we move into the target of locally manufacturing up to 60% of our vaccines by 2040. So I hope that we can achieve this, because then it gives us a better negotiating position as a continent.
It's really helpful. Look, I got to say, this has just been such an educational and enlightening conversation. I want to thank all three of you, but we're not quite done yet. We're just coming up on the hour, and I think we might close with Saad, maybe to bring all of this together. Saad, I didn't speak much about Pakistan because I just think there was so much value in hearing Paul and Elizabeth explain the dynamics in Africa and some of the context and the institutional dynamics. One thing that definitely pops out at me from what Elizabeth just said, Saad, is the contaminative power of this debate on domestic governance and domestic politics, right? Here you have, I think, probably some, I don't know anything about the head of the African CDC, but he sounds like, like this kind of visionary who really cares about the people of Africa and its stature. And he's made this declaration. Concurrently, of course, you have elites in Nairobi, in Kampala, all around Africa, who will be running to whatever doorway or whatever pathway where there's a vaccine available. So if somebody's smuggling in Sinovac or CanSino or Sinopharm or Sputnik, regardless, those quote unquote black markets are going to develop, even if there's a generic ban at the Africa Union level or even in the country level. some countries like Pakistan have tried to manage that by opening it up and by saying the private sector is allowed to bring in their own vaccines. But Pakistan is also discovering how hard that is, because the political cost of a vaccine for rich people that costs too little is too high, and the political cost of a vaccine that costs too much in terms of perception is also very high. And so the Drug Regulation Authority here in Pakistan has been sitting on the decision on pricing for Sputnik and a couple of others solely on the basis of this kind of political conundrum that they find themselves in. When you study and when you and your colleagues look at these kinds of issues, how much of the science does all of this undermine, right? I mean, ideally, public health should be a science-only discussion. Let's work on the science, make it cheaper, and make everything available, as we've been talking about repeatedly. But the reality of how these different places that aren't as privileged in terms of income levels, the reality of how they operate really impedes that scientific part of the discussion. So how does all this come together, and how do we solve for places like Uganda, Pakistan, Nigeria, Kenya?
So public health and global health specifically has accepted actually that we have to live with a part of the, with the political aspect of global health solutions. And it's not new to global health, for starting with smallpox eradication, and even before that, creation of WHO. WHO is not just a public health entity. It is an entity grounded in political realities of working together to address some of these bigger problems. If you look at the structure, if you look at the World Health Assembly, it's not just purely technocratic and so on and so forth. What is different is politics that is short-sighted versus politics that has a long vision, that looks at the long game and says, what is in most people's interests, and often these are not, as I said, that certain countries are framing, in terms of their policies, this as a zero-sum game. And when that happens, it's a little bit of an amateur hour, not only in terms of science side, but also in terms of geopolitical side as well, if I may submit to that. If I may submit that. And the reason I'm saying that is, for example, everyone could have benefited from a robust array of vaccine products that are not necessarily competing with each other to ramp up supply. But now we have in a situation in terms of Russia, where sorry, I'm hearing my echo a little bit, so that's a bit distracting. If someone can sort of adjust the audio. So if you're in a situation where Russia, working with the Sovereign Wealth Fund, is treating it as quasi-diplomacy, quasi-marketing, without strengthening the regulatory part of it. And so you probably saw the news out of Brazil earlier in terms of Slovakia, their drug regulatory authorities, etc., raising questions about the consistency of the manufacturing process. A lot of that could have been avoided if you played straight and you had compliance with global regulatory regimes, and if there were a serious desire to impose domestic regulatory standards. So, for example, in Pakistan, there was very little asked of what was happening in the private sector of certain products being marketed. And that doesn't mean that these were unsafe or non-efficacious vaccines, but it did increase the systemic risk of due to the uncertainty about some of the data that are out there. And so what countries like Pakistan and countries in Africa, both individually and together, can do is make sure that this crisis results not only in development of domestic manufacturing capacity, which is part of the solution, and even starting with fill and finish is actually pretty reasonable, because it's not just that it's just a start. It is a true bottleneck in certain, even now when we talk about these vaccines, then strengthening and harmonizing. So in a way, ease up on the bureaucracy, but ramp up the capacity to do true regulatory oversight. And so that means that the net burden doesn't go necessarily up on manufacturers, on distributors, on importers, but it's the right kind of regulation so that your systemic risk in the future goes down. And to take advantage of this, to make sure that there are long-term investments in, so even if you don't have capacity to do mRNA studies, mRNA vaccine development for the next drug that is important for you, you have phase 3 trial capacity. Right now, Pakistan has pretty robust phase 3 trial capacity. I have done trials in Pakistan. And so I know that there is a robust capacity. Why was that there wasn't, beyond CanSino, where the data was essentially sent to the manufacturer, why, unlike the Chinese, unlike the Brazilians and other entities, these studies were not done? And why was it that the government continued to fly blind? So that's one example. Why not develop our own quality assays in Pakistan? Why not the country develops its own quality assays so that they have the ability to make sure that it is when it goes to the market, it is shopping with its eyes open? Why not have a situation where some of us were jumping up and down on Pakistani television and on various channels in May, June, July, August of 2020, saying that the country needs to get ready for the most unprecedented vaccine distribution program. And that included looking at your risks, mitigating like product 1, 2, 3, system of purchase 1, 2, 3, in a sense that if COVAX doesn't work, what are the other arrangements? So there was a little bit of an amateur hour going on there. And so when we step back from this, when various countries step back from this, one solution and one way to move forward is to have that long-term look and this long-term perspective to say that how do we decrease the vulnerability from the impacts of future mass biological events, like a pandemic of the next coronavirus strain, or the next flu strain, or the next Ebola or Lassa or CCHF, Congo Crimean hemorrhagic fever that pops up in Balochistan with some frequency, etc. So these kinds of things that have the potential to undermine the overall function of society, and increasingly so, should be dealt with a strategic approach, not necessarily through an apolitical approach, but through smart geopolitical postures, rather than sort of narrowly focusing on one-upmanship.
I think that's a great note on which we can take away, I think, a lot of really valuable insights. I think in terms of things to do, like you articulated, Saad, the planning out and mapping out of a vision as to where these countries want to be. I'm still fascinated by the degree of unity and coherence through the African CDC in Africa, and I'm really grateful, Elizabeth, to you for everything that you brought to the conversation. Paul, to you for your really excellent contribution, and Saad for bringing it all together. And not mincing any words on the nature of amateur hour. I think that's a whole separate conversation or series of conversations as to how the response was managed. But I think it's conversations like this that help us really scrape through some of the noise and get to real issues. And I'm so grateful that all three of you walked us through those issues. I hope you guys will keep coming back because we intend to keep asking you back, but really grateful for this opportunity and this conversation. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Saad.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care now.
It was a pleasure.